Again by just giving a couple of minutes, because I don't want to go too deeply in, to just discussing one issue that is in the news pertaining to the condition of the economy and the financial markets. One of the things that's happened recently is that for the first time, literally in a generation, we're talking about the possibility of what some economists call reflation, which means setting the economy up in a way where we start to go in a process of sustained inflation. Now, for many years, the bigger fear of the Federal Reserve was that we would fall into deflation. Deflation is not exactly the opposite side of the coin from inflation. Deflation is a process of falling prices. But when prices fall like that, it leads to bankruptcies and it leads to businesses failing. Because what it really is saying is that a business buys its resources for $1. I would appreciate it if you would stop passing these chats around. They are disturbing. If a business acquires its resources for $1 but ends up having to sell it for 80 cents, can't stay in business terribly long that way. And we have had a persistent pattern in terms of our inflation where prices of goods for a half generation have actually been falling and services prices have been rising. So any inflation that we had was really in services, medical care, education, legal services, accountancy, travel, the services of restaurants and so forth. This is being recorded. We have had only services inflation. Since the pandemic, it has flipped around. It's flipped around, and all of the inflation really has been in goods, and services prices have fallen. Of course, because people have not been able to use restaurants and hair salons, and they're not flying as much, and they're not using hotels, and they're not going to resorts. Well, one of the things that started to happen is that as we've used more and more goods relative to services, the price of goods has gone up significantly. And when that occurs, goods go on shipping containers and go across the ocean. So the rates that the big shipping companies around the world are charging has gone up dramatically. So if you've got something coming, say, from Shanghai and going to Rotterdam in Europe, or going from Rotterdam to, to the port of Newark or something like that, those rates for putting that cargo container on the ship have gone up. And since we're using more goods because we're home more food, more clothing, more gift giving, more alcohol, the prices of those things have gone up. Well, one of the things that's happening recently is, as the economy is starting to revive a little bit, services prices are starting to rise too. So not only are we seeing commodity prices rise, we're seeing transportation prices rise. By the way, Delta Airlines just announced that they are raising their fares. We're starting to get to the point where, remember, we started with goods prices falling and services prices going up. Then it flipped with goods prices going up and services prices going down. Well, now they're going up at roughly the same rate. And that's something we're starting to watch. And as we'll see later in the semester, as inflation builds into the system, it starts to build into interest rates. And when interest rates start to rise, and they are in fact rising on the long end because of inflation expectations, we begin to see real dilemmas as to how to proceed. What good is it to get, say, a stimulus check, and the value of that stimulus check gets eroded because the prices of the things you buy is going up? Now, we're not talking about rampant inflation. We're talking about fractions of a percentage point, going maybe from 1 3/4 up to 2 or 2.10 or 2.15. That's all we're talking about now, but it's enough to push interest rates higher, which would push mortgage rates higher, which would mean there'd be less activity in the housing market. And housing is such a big part of the economy, it start to drag down economic growth. This is what we're watching. So what I've said to you is not a forecast. It is just sort of an alert. It's the kind of thing that economists are watching very carefully. Combine that now with the fact that you're getting a massive amount of stimulus that's going to be coming out of Congress. It won't be 1.9 trillion. It'll be more likely more than roughly about half of that. But that creates aggregate demand, and it creates aggregate demand without creating more aggregate supply. So that puts upward pressure on prices. And then on top of it, you've got a Federal Reserve that is committed to buying $80 billion worth of securities every month. That's $80 billion of bank reserves that go into the banking system, eventually becomes money supply, and then that could become inflationary. This is what we're watching carefully now, and it's something we haven't been watching, I would dare say, something that has not been on our lips really now, probably since you were a child. So we'll watch that very carefully. I wanted to point that out to you because we'll be discussing all of these kinds of processes throughout the semester, and I think it's worth mentioning to you. So I'll stop right here, and then we'll dig into our class for the day. Any questions about any of that? Okay. One of the things that I do with these kinds of discussions is to try to get you to understand how economists think. What do we put together? What runs through our mind all the time? And so far, what we've done in our very first class is to say, hey, look, one of the things that runs through our mind, of course, is that we pay attention a lot to the laws of economics, different concepts and the like, and we pay attention to a lot of detailed information. And a lot of that detailed information is embedded in statistics like the GDP or the Consumer Price Index, which we then disaggregate, we break into parts so that we can see what's happening underneath the surface. The point here being, economics is an empirical study. We're nothing as macroeconomists without really good data. And that's why I had the very first class that I did for and with you. And so I asked you a couple of questions about these things, as you know. Well, then we said, okay, what is this really all about? And what it's really all about is we want the economy to grow. And we know that the nature of economic growth is really the sense that the GDP accounts tells us that the act of producing an output creates sufficient income to buy it all up if there are no leaks. In other words, if it's a closed economy. So it's very important to get output, and it's very important to get the income that comes from producing that output. And when we do that, that's when we grow. And so the idea is always to try to make the economy grow. Yes, we want it to be stable. Yes, we want it to be fair or equitable. Yes, we want it to be efficient. These are all very standard goals. But that efficiency, that equity, that fairness doesn't matter if the economy is not growing. If our standard of living in an economic sense is not improving, we're going to have very hard times. And there are countries in the world, as you know, that continue to struggle. They just can't seem to get their economy going. They're in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, it's disproportionately represented in the southern hemisphere of the world, but that's just disproportionate. Okay, so what we try to do is get the economy to grow, and we realize that, as I pointed out to you, that one of the standard lessons that we'll learn in this course is that when we look at the drivers of GDP growth, really it comes down to 4 variables. It comes down to the quality of labor and its quantity. It comes down to the quality of capital and its quantity. And you put it together and then you add things like time, because you need time to have a productive process. You need best known techniques, so you need good management, you need infrastructure. I mean, what good would Blackboard be if we didn't have good Wi-Fi, if we didn't have 5G? If I couldn't communicate through this medium, we'd be stuck. And that's part of the infrastructure of the country. But so too are the ports and the airlines. I've already talked about container ships. What good is it if there's no place for them to dock? If we didn't have the infrastructure to take the cargo crates off the ships and get them onto a truck that's part of the infrastructure. And what good would it be maybe if that truck didn't go to a railroad yard and put it on a railroad? And so when we look at all of these things combined, these are the things that we look at that we know are prominent in growth. Now, I assigned to you or gave to you an article that is on Blackboard in this topic, and it talks about some of the perils to China's economic growth. And one of the perils to economic growth in China is that the population really has stopped growing at the rate it was before, but also that the economy is so deeply in debt that both people, businesses, and governments are really reluctant now to go out and extend more credit and make the economy grow. That debt, of course, like all debt, has to be repaid. And so maybe it's the way you think as well. If you have a large amount of debt, maybe it's student loans or a car loan or whatever for the place you live, you may be reluctant to go out and maybe eat in a restaurant as often, or take a trip, or maybe even go to school for a semester or a year, because the debt is there. Well, some of that is starting to show up in China, and that's why its secular or its trend growth rate has been coming down. You may find that article interesting, and you may find it interesting side by side with another article I put there, which has to do with Canada, which is the opposite story. And one of the things that's happened in Canada is that its economic growth on a trend base is being propelled by the fact that they have a population wave, and that population wave is coming from immigration. Now, apparently what's happening is a lot of people in the world want to come to North America, but they're looking at some of the problems of living here, especially under the Trump regime, and they're going, well, I don't know. I used to want to go to the US, but Canada is North American and it's pretty culturally similar to the US, and it's a little bit colder, but maybe I'll go to Canada. And so they have had an immigration wave. And of course, this on the West Coast, city like Vancouver or Victoria, British Columbia, have beautiful weather. And of course, they're on the West Coast, so you get a lot of Asian immigration into China. I'm sorry, into Canada. And so that is boosting secular or trend economic growth in Canada. Something worthwhile for you to think about. If you have 5 minutes to read these newspaper articles, I think it'll be worth your time. And we talked about the fact last time that when we think about growth, we have to think about it in terms of a production function. And I said a typical recipe is really what you think about with a production function. You know, you put the resources together, that's the food. You use some capital, that's the stove and the pots and pans. And you use some time, and hopefully you have some skills so you don't cook the way I do. And, you know, actually I'm a good cook, so I shouldn't say that. But there's some skill that's involved, and the better the skill, the better the product is going to be. This is what we know. But what we're really focusing on is trying to raise the potential growth rate of our economy, where potential and sustainable really are the same thing. Sustainable meaning it's what you think you can continue to do over a long time period. It's not cyclical. It doesn't go up and down. It's sort of a trend line. You know, it's sort of the long-term possibilities for what you get. And in the US, that's about 2.75% a year for real GDP. So how do we calculate that number? And the shorthand that we use, and it is just a shorthand, is to look at productivity growth plus growth in hours worked. Now, sometimes we use productivity growth plus growth in the labor force, because the labor force is a proxy measure for hours worked. But let's take a look at what that means. We're talking about productivity. From productivity, we get output. I live on 2nd Avenue, and there's a lot. We get sirens, we get horns. I'm sorry about that. Productivity growth. That's where we get output. And to get output, you need you need efficiency, you need capital, you need labor to get output. But you also have to have that labor input puts it all together. So what's sustainable? The productivity growth you get, which gives you sort of that trend up, and it gets affected a little bit each time, up or down at the margin, by growth in hours worked or growth in the labor force. You put that together, You tell me a country's productivity growth and you tell me about its labor force, and I could pretty much tell you how much that economy is going to be growing over the long term. That is what we consider to be sustainable. It's possible that the economy can grow faster than that. If we get a surge in productivity growth for whatever reason, we're coming out of a really bad time in the business cycle and all of a sudden the economy just takes off, which is, by the way, what many economists think is going to happen in the second half of this year. If you get that surge, the economy could actually grow faster than its sustainable rate. And if that occurs, well, that's a very positive sign. But if it stays that way, it means you're creating more aggregate demand than your productivity could generate, which gives you supply, and that potentially could be inflationary. So we watch that very carefully. So I pointed out to you that we look at total factor productivity. The key here is the relationship between capital and labor. It's the capital-labor ratios, which we'll see becomes very important in the Solow model. Very, very important to get the amount of capital per unit of labor to rise. And those countries that are able to do that tend to have the fastest productivity growth and tend to have the fastest sustainable growth in their economy over a long time period. The US has been masterful in that, and that's partially why we continue to be either the leading or the second leading economy in the world. And what makes that possible? So for those, somebody said she wants a better explanation of total factor productivity, and I think here it is in this particular chart. Understanding its determination. We look at the things that give us total factor productivity, and it's tied to raising the level of capital per unit of labor. All said, it's affected by a number of other things, some of which aren't even measurable. So let's take a look at those. This is saying, hey, look, it's one thing to have a high ratio of capital to labor, but there are other things that explains why the US was the leading economy for 50 or 60 or 70 years. And even if it may not be, and I'm not sure, it may be number one, it may be number two now, depending on how we measure China. There are other things that made the economy strong. These are things that could be considered in many ways intangible. So let's take a look at them. So certainly the quantity and quality of human capital. Your college students, and the US has the highest percentage of people in higher education. The US, until recently, was the #1 location for international students to come to study here. And it meant studying anything. It could be medicine, it could be law, it could be technology, it could be many things that are out there, but it was a big attraction. It still remains. In New York City, the biggest industry in New York City is healthcare. The second biggest industry in New York City is education. And just think about all the schools we have here. Think of all the CUNY schools. My goodness, I personally have taught in, 5 or 6 CUNY schools. CCNY, Queens, Queensboro, Manhattan Community, Kingsborough Community, Lehman College, Baruch. I don't even remember. That's 7 in where I just taught, but you have NYU and you have Columbia and you have Barnard and you have Fordham and you have St. John's, and I can just go on and on. Look at all the schools that are here. So we get a large amount of educated people, i.e. a high quality of human capital. But we also have a whole array of tangible and intangible capital that affects TFP. Tangible capital. Your laptop is tangible capital. Tangible means you can touch it. It's physical. The software in it is intangible. Because if you don't have intangible capital, your laptop doesn't do anything. And so if you think of a Starbucks, for example, Starbucks is loaded with tangible and intangible capital. Starbucks has the machines to make the coffee, but it has the Wi-Fi in there, which is why people sit in their laptops and their iPads. And some of them aren't even buying coffee or anything in there. They're just sitting in there with friends and they're talking, but they're playing with their devices. But those devices don't do anything if you cannot get on the internet in a Starbucks. So we have to have intangible capital. The state of technological advancement. One thing that is absolutely true, and we'll discuss this at a later date, new capital is always better than old capital, period. Oh, we talked about this on Monday. A new machine is always better than an old one. You don't want a laptop that was manufactured in the year 2005. You don't. You don't. Even if you could use it, you probably couldn't get any software to work with it. So new capital is better than old. And if you have a flood of new capital, now having the new capital come out, having it get disseminated so people can use it and businesses can use it and governments can use it is one thing. And then having its adoption is another thing. We've had the capacity to do things like Blackboard Collaborate Ultra and Zoom for a long time. It was disseminated. It was out there. Nobody was using it until we got into the coronavirus situation. We talked about supply chains being so important. We talked about the example from this week with Ford saying, you know what, we can't manufacture certain of our stuff in Canada because we don't have semiconductors. There's just a shortage of semiconductors. The supply chain was broken. So to the extent that you could keep the supply chain going, you're in great shape. You need strong financial markets because it's through financial markets that we finance. Now that sounds trite, but if you need money, you got to get it somehow. The purpose of financial markets is to take the excess savings from people, put it into a financial intermediary, and let somebody borrow it. If we don't have credit growth, we don't have expansion in the economy. What business is going to be able to buy massive amounts of equipment if they don't borrow? Not terribly many. We know that management and governance matters. Management is relevant. You know, when I always had this expression that I used to tell the people who reported to me. I would say, you know what? You are one manager away, one new manager away from having the worst job you ever had or the best job you ever had. Those of you who are working know that's true. You may report to somebody who you think is great, and you live in fear that that manager is ever going to leave because the next manager that comes in could take the great job and really make it awful. Management matters. Yeah, it is an understatement, Calvin. The strength of institutions. One of the things that sets us apart is we have a strong set of institutions. Believe it or not, we do have a constitution in the United States. Believe it or not, those traditions still hold no matter what happened with Donald Trump. But we have a legal system and we have protections for consumers and we have antitrust to make sure that there's no monopolistic power being executed. These things all matter. And then, of course, natural resources. All of these things are behind the surface of saying that the ratio of capital to labor really matters. So here in that context, and this now we're into new stuff, this is basically saying, hey, here is a production function for China. It's the yellow line. But if China had the same total factor productivity as the United States, look at where the output per person would be. So you see the dot on the yellow line just goes straight up. Look how much more they would have had. And compare that to the production function for the United States, where A captures all of those sort of intangible things that I talked about before, and K stands for capital. Look at that. So what this is really saying is that if China had the same total factor productivity of the US, the amount of output per person would be significantly higher, but it still wouldn't compare to the productivity we have in the US. Why? Because of all those other things you saw in the previous slide. The strength of the institutions, the supply chains, etc. Okay. I'm sorry about this. I can't explain why this came out this way, so I will skip it, but it'll be clear to you when you see it. But what this is really saying is, okay, let's start to set up a model where we say Y or output or income is some function of capital and labor. And let's work on the assumption that A bar, let's use A bar to capture all of those things that go into total factor productivity. And say hypothetically that capital accounts for 1/3 of our output and labor input accounts for 2/3 of our input. It's just a standard model, which we call a production function. Again, the recipe that I talked about before. It's just the standard. And there is some empirical value to it, but effectively it's just an assumption just for theoretical purposes. So here are some aspects of the model. Per capita GDP is higher if there's more capital per person, obviously. Skip to the third bullet point. Capital per person is subject to strong diminishing returns because the exponent is much less than 1. Now we're starting to get into a couple of concepts that are absolutely essential, but not really hard to understand. If your car was stuck in the snow and you couldn't get your car out, it would be helpful to have a shovel to shovel the snow away from you, especially from your back tires. That would be great. And if that one shovel was able to get the snow away and you were able to get your car out of that parking spot, fantastic. Your output, one moved car. But what if it didn't work? The question would be, would you be better off with 2 shovels? Well, you might be better off with 2 shovels if you shoveled by one wheel and someone else shoveled by the other wheel, and the 2 of you together were able to get the job done. So your output would be you got the car out faster, and there was actually a marginal return to having the second person shoveling with you. What if you had a 3rd shovel? It would probably help, but not terribly much. What if you had a 4th shovel? Probably wouldn't help at all. So the point here is, as you add more and more machines to something, more and more capital, you do get more output, but the additional output you get for each extra machine that you add is less and less. And that's what we mean by saying there are diminishing returns. This is a basic microeconomics concept. And so for those of you who have had any calculus, it says that when you relate changes in capital to changes in output, you have a positive first derivative, meaning as you add more capital, you do get more output, but a negative second derivative, meaning the additional output that you get gets smaller and smaller. You are increasing your output at a decreasing rate as you add more capital. Fundamental principle. And what it really says is that there is a right amount of capital that businesses need to have. They can't just say, let's just load up on capital, more equipment, more desks, more computers, more software packages, more needles and threads and more hypodermic needles so we can give COVID vaccine. After a while, it's too much and you don't get any benefit from it. So that's what this is saying. Yes, add to your capital stock. Yes, as you add to your capital stock, you will increase your output. But each time you add capital, the increase in output becomes smaller and smaller until you get to the point where you add more capital and your output doesn't go up. And then you know you have hit the point to stop. And we'll get to that in a moment. Okay? So let me stop right there with that point and ask you if you have any questions, because that's pretty fundamental. Because we will be getting to arguably the most complicated part of the semester in about 5 minutes. Okay. So we talk a lot about what's called a Cobb-Douglas production function, which is exactly what you just saw. A Cobb-Douglas production function, capital with an exponent of alpha, labor with an exponent of 1 minus alpha. In other words, the 2 exponents add up to 1. So if 1 is 1/3, 1 minus alpha would be 2/3. That's what you're getting. And what this is saying is that more outputs come from more inputs, exactly what I just said to you. Now, this is something I put together from the days when I had a blackboard. And I would always start the class by saying, all right, let me put some symbols on the board. They used to say that every doctoral dissertation defense, and I went through that a long, long time ago, begins with the same thing. It says, Let me introduce some notation, and then you introduce all this notation. So here's a whole bunch of notation, and here's how it plays out. This is easy for you to read. I won't go through this. This is self-explanatory, and you could read this on your own time. And now we're back to that concept, the marginal product of capital, an increase in output caused by an additional 1 unit of capital. The marginal product diminishes as more and more capital is added. That's what I said before. Positive first derivative, negative second derivative of output with respect to increases in capital. Or if you haven't had any calculus, what that's saying is that as you add more and more capital, the extra amount of output that you get gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's where we were. And this is pretty much the same thing. And this shows it. This is what we're talking about. You'll notice how the curve curves and how it flattens out as we go up, because the additional amount of output shrinks the more capital that we add. This is just the same concept. It's just showing it for you. But take a look at the slopes of that green line or blue line, whatever it is, and you get a sense of what I was talking about. Okay? I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. This is a chart I've showed you before. I showed it to you in a previous class. I just want you to be sure that you understand this, that if we're working in a world where there are only two sectors, households and businesses, labor falls into the household sector, of course. I mean, you and I are parts of households and we work. We're in the household sector. But what's happened is that our share of income has been falling secularly, or as a trend now, for a very long time. It's not a huge percentage change. It was got as high as about 70%. It's now roughly 65. But what it's saying is that capital has become more and more and more important in generating output, and it's something that we need to watch. And some of this might begin to change. As we begin to get, say, maybe a $15 minimum wage, as we begin to get an economy that's growing strongly again and the unemployment rate drops back maybe into the 4s or into the 3s again. We got as low as 3.8. We're now at 6.3. It's a long way to go. Maybe labor's share of income will rise. More workers earning more money, because there are labor shortages in many, many different occupations. Because one response to the COVID virus is that businesses have learned that they need different types of labor than they anticipated before. Jobs in certain industries and occupations have become obsolete. So if you worked in a McDonald's, chances are, if you lost your job, you may not get it back because you will be replaced by an automated system that really already exists. The last time I went into a fast food place, I went in and I went to a counter to order, and the person behind the counter said, no, go to the kiosk over there. And I typed in what I wanted, and then I waited a little while, and I looked behind the counter, and a robot put my food together. And then I got a message that said, and it was a text message saying, pick up my food at the left end of the counter. I basically never talked to anybody, and I paid completely online. I paid completely electronically, no person. So what I'm getting at is all of this is changing, and it's going to change in terms of your education. More and more and more classes are going to be taught the way we're doing things this morning. I was asked next semester, how would I prefer to teach, in the classroom or stay remote? I was given the choice. And so you're going to see more remote classes, and my guess is that over time, those remote classes are going to become more and more and more prevalent. What college campuses are going to look like is going to change dramatically. And the beauty of having these remote classes is, instead of having one professor like you have this morning, you'll take a macroeconomics class, and maybe the Solow growth model, which we'll discuss in a second, will be taught to you by Robert Solow. Not by me, by Solow. He'll be paid by CCNY or Queens College or whatever to teach you that class. And it'll be recorded. And it'll be not asynchronous. And you'll get the solo growth model from Solo. And you'll get old lectures from the monetarists, from Milton Friedman, let's say, who's dead for 30 years. But it'll be an old lecture that he recorded when he was at the University of Chicago. You'll get that explaining the linkages between the money supply and inflation. It's going to be fantastic. But what it says is that the role of professors is going to be completely different. And the role of universities and buildings on universities, completely different. Shopping malls are going, as you know, they're going out of business. And you look at shopping malls all over the place, and you know what they're doing? They're turning them into entertainment places, activity places you go to dance, places you go to do video games, places you go to hit golf balls, places you go for indoor skiing, water skiing, or snow skiing. That's what's happening to the shopping malls because all of these department stores and retail stores are going out of business. But that means the nature of the jobs that are there are completely different. If I have a place that teaches people how to hit baseballs, and I used to do that, I did that. I had a business where I taught people to hit baseballs. I had a cage in my backyard. That's gone. That's now indoors, and the swing is analyzed electronically, and I can say, okay, the reason why your ball is going up is because you're dropping your back elbow, and I can see that on a screen where you're comparing your swing to the most perfect baseball swing that might be out there. Wow. Totally changes even how we teach kids how to hit a baseball. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the midst of the greatest, biggest industrial revolution the world has ever seen. The jobs you will enter into in the course of your life are unimaginable in 2021. But maybe not. Maybe that my lesson to you with that is that you better start thinking about what those jobs are going to be and prepare yourself and your skill set and your education to meet those. So the weaknesses of the model: in the absence of total factor productivity, you can incorrectly measure differences in income. Well, of course, because if income is not determined by total factor productivity, it's got to be determined by something. Maybe it's determined by wealth. Think about it now. The stock market again today for a while, until about 11 o'clock, this was true, was up again. Another all-time record. People who had money to invest, who could grow their wealth, had their wealth growing regardless of TFP. So if you're trying to judge income, you may get a statement from whoever is managing your money if you're fortunate enough to do that, and you look, wow, it's been a great year. My portfolio was up 10% or 12% or 40%, which has happened sometimes, or down 30%. This is growth in income to people, and they didn't go to work. It had nothing to do with their productivity. So we got to be very careful about this. And the model does not provide an answer as to why countries have different TFP levels. Not offhand, except that there was a slide a while back that did explain why. Differences in the capital labor ratio, but also all those other things: quality of management, supply chains, institutions that function like a good credit system. So we do know something about that. This is empirical. It just shows the levels of total factor productivity around the world normalized to the US. So what this is saying is, okay, take the US's total factor productivity and make that 1 and compare everybody else's total factor productivity to the US. So you can see Switzerland 5.2% higher than the US, but China at 42.9 means it's what? 57.1% lower in terms of its total factor productivity. These are just numbers. You can examine them as you wish. But in the end, this is the question that we are dealing with all the time. Why doesn't capital flow to those countries? So marginal product of capital, meaning the amount of output that you get for each unit of capital, is higher in poor countries with a small amount of capital. Why doesn't currency flow there? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The reason why they have a higher MPK is because they have so little capital. You know, I discuss this with people all the time. I call it the law of large numbers and the law of small numbers. If someone has $1 and I give them a second dollar, they had a 100% gain. Oh my God, the marginal gain was 100%. They went from $1 to $2. If someone has $100 and I give them $1, they went from 100 to 101. They had a 1% gain. Well, the first guy had a 100% gain. The second guy had a 1% gain. But I ask you, who would you rather be, the first guy or the second? The guy who has $2 or the guy who has 101? And there you go. So when you look at the big economies in the world that have been established and big for a long time, like the US, like Western Europe in particular, like Japan, and you look at their growth rates, they tend to be less growth rates, but they're starting from a higher base. But you take a country that started out with a low amount of capital and a country that was relatively less affluent, every time they grow in percentage changes, you look at it and you go, wow, that's a big percentage change. Yeah, but it's off a small base. They're like the guy who went from $1 to $2 and said, I was up 100%. Well, good for you. I'd rather be the guy who goes from 100 to 101 and was up by 1%. So that's the answer to that question. So here we go. We're going to start talking about the Solow growth model, and we're going to be talking about physical capital, human capital, and notice what Solow does. He makes it not L, but EL, and what he's really saying is the quality of the labor. So you have physical capital is his first variable. His second variable is the quality of the labor, the educational level times the labor force. And then he ends up with a production function that says output is a function of all that stuff that goes into total factor productivity, plus the amount of capital, plus the quality of labor. That's the essence of his model. I'm going to skip ahead and go to the explanation. Okay. All right. A number of years ago, I was teaching elsewhere, and we got to the Solow growth model, and we were using a different textbook. We weren't using Jones's textbook. We were using Gregory Mankiw's textbook, which was the standard book in this particular school. It actually happened to be Barnard College. And then I adapted it to a course that I gave at CCNY, where all of the students in my class were engineering students. So they were mathematically pretty sophisticated. And over the years, I've looked at these notes that I put here, and I said, you know what? Whenever I teach the Solow model in any class, Queens College, CCNY, Barnard, NYU, I don't really care, I better put together a series of notes that puts it all together because it's really complex. But even though it's complex, it's easy. There is not a concept that we're going to go through in the next, 15 minutes or so that is really complicated. I'm sorry, that is really difficult. Complicated, but not difficult. All things that say you're going to see about 20 bullet points, maybe fewer. And if you study each of these bullet points, you don't have to open up your textbook and read about Solow. You don't have to do anything. The remainder of this particular section of your course is embodied in these bullet points. I've done this for you. I've taken notes for you. I've written these notes for you. And these are all concepts that are fairly easy. What it really is going to amount to, ladies and gentlemen, is your ability to do simple algebra. You know, if y equals c plus I and y equals c plus s, then I equals s. That's the first bullet point. Okay, so let's start to go down these bullet points one at a time. And I implore you, I beg you, that if we get to anything that I say here, which I think is self-apparent, but if it's not self-apparent to you, you stop me and you say, hey, Steve, didn't quite get that point. Could you go over it again? And that's why we go to school. That's why That's why I have the privilege of being in these classes with you, to go over this stuff with you. So let's start at the top. So the essence of the solo growth model, which is studied, as I pointed out in our last class, in every university in the world. I repeat that, every university in the world where there is a macroeconomics class, you study the solo growth model. So you will be on the same plane as students at Columbia and NYU and the London School of Economics, because they're studying the same thing. So bullet point number 1 basically says, okay, let's assume we have a world with 2 sectors, only households and businesses, consumption and investment, no government, so we don't have to deal with taxes or anything like that, and no foreign sector, no trade. All trade is domestic trade. A 2-sector model, not a 4-sector model. Now remember, when we study GDP, it's 4 sectors: households, businesses, governments, and the rest of the world. Here we're saying, let's simplify it. 2 sectors constitute the entire economy: households who engage in C, or personal consumption expenditures, and businesses that are engaged in gross private domestic investment, or I. So we say, okay, in a world that has 2 sectors, GDP, or Y, and that should say Y equals, I'm sorry, C plus I, that's just the typo, not Y plus C plus I, it should say Y equals C plus I. I'm sorry about that. Y, or total GDP, or total output, is consumption plus investment. That's your basic GDP model with 2 sectors. But it also says that there are 2 things that you could do with your income. Remember, output equals income. You could spend it or not spend it. So Y also equals C plus S. So if Y equals C plus I and Y equals C plus S, then I has to equal S. It means that investment has to equal, my goodness, I'm sorry about the symbols. Investment has to equal savings. I will correct this, I'm sorry. So it should say Y equals C plus I, Y equals C plus S, so I equals S. I do apologize for the errors. I must have read this 100 times and never noticed it before. Second bullet point. For a given level of the capital stock, the production function, which is output is a function of capital, determines how much output the economy produces. What it's saying is that in order to get output, you must have capital to produce that output. You can't produce anything if you don't have any equipment. So output is going to be determined by your capital stock and by its savings rate. Well, of course, because building up of the capital stock is investment. And in order to invest, you have to have savings. I equals S. And that determines the allocation of output between consumption and investment. That's basically the top line. No, Y is for income, I is for investment. Okay? I will correct this, I apologize. Okay, let's go to the third bullet point. The savings rate determines the allocation between consumption and investment. Well, of course it does, because there's only 2 things you can do with your income. You could spend it or not spend it. What we don't spend, we call savings, but savings equals investment. And so the savings rate determines the allocation between consumption and investment, because the savings rate determines the allocation between consumption and savings equals investment. So you'll notice that all of these things being equal to each other is really where this is all going. So for any level of capital, which is what you get when you invest, output's a function of capital. Investment is a function of how savings relate to capital, SFK. And consumption is a function of capital minus that second function, which is determined by savings, or output per worker minus investment per worker. So if you take output per worker and subtract off investment per worker, you're going to get savings per worker, because S plus I are equal to each other.
Professor,
Yes, sir.
I'm a little bit confused by, so you have f of k and then you have sf of k. What does the second one mean?
Because SF of k is because savings determine how much you can invest, and investment determines how much capital you get. So if investment and savings have to be equal to each other, the S determines how much capital spending you can get.
So
Think of it this way.
the s is being multiplied to the function f of k?
Yes.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay. So then Solo goes on and he talks about something called the steady state of capital stock, which he calls K star. It's the level at which the rate of investment, which is determined by savings, right? S times the function of capital equals the rate of depreciation of the capital stock. Let me stop right there. What this is really saying is that economies tend to gravitate towards something called the steady state of the capital stock. In other words, you'll remember that as you add more and more capital, output goes up, but at a decreasing rate. The marginal product of capital is negative, it declines. You keep adding capital until you get to the point where the next piece of capital you add only is there to take care of a piece of equipment that may have fully depreciated. What does that mean? Suppose you have 10 machines, and that 10th machine adds, of course, the smallest amount of new output. So number 9 added more, number 8 added more than that, number 7 added more than that, the first one added the most. Now you have that 10th machine. If you go to number 11, chances are it's not going to add anything to output. The only reason you buy that 11th machine is that the first one that you bought years and years ago becomes fully depreciated and you have to replace it. So when you're in the steady state, you only add capital, an additional unit of capital, to replace another piece of capital that is fully depreciated. That's what the steady state is. You're not adding any more capital to get more output because you can't. Going to 11 machines will not add to your output. If you go to the 11th machine, you're only buying it because the first machine you bought has now become fully depreciated. You get rid of it. Question?
Yeah, Professor?
Yeah.
Doesn't it also depend on the scenario that you're in? For example, if you're a factory that produces clothes and then you add 20 machines and each machine is capable of producing the same amount of clothes, and then you add like another machine, would output still decrease like for every additional machine?
Now let's be careful, okay? I didn't say output decreases. I said the marginal amount that each new machine adds decreases.
That's what I meant. Would a marginal amount that the 21st machine be less than the
Well,
20th
suppose you
machine?
go to 100 machines. What if you don't have any? What if the demand for the clothing that you're sewing is just not there? You've added machines,
Okay.
but they're sitting there idle. They're not doing anything.
Okay.
Now wait. No, you're onto something, because if each of the machines were equally capable and you put them on the floor at the same time, then you would say that adding another machine would not result in a lower marginal amount of output that comes out because all the machines are the same. But what he argues here is that over time, as you add more and more capital, the newest machines are the best, the oldest machines are the worst, and then they fully depreciate and you got to get rid of them. And so that's why you have this diminishing marginal Marginal product of capital. It's because the additional machines don't help you anymore. And so you get to a point where you've just added too many machines, they don't help you. Okay, so sure, you might get more, but again, think of a plot of land and you have a tractor on this plot of land. And let's make it a small plot of land. It's only 1 acre. You have 1 acre of land and you have to cut down the corn. Well, if you have a tractor to cut down the corn, that's great. That's going to help you. 2 tractors, you get it done in half the time. 3 tractors, and the tractors are going to start bumping into each other. Then it's not going to help. 4 tractors, yeah, you'll cut down the corn much faster, but there'll be no space, and eventually you're going to start getting all kinds of damage to the soil, and you're not going to do very well. So the point here is, as you keep adding more and more of this capital, you get to a point where it doesn't add anything for you anymore. And then what happens in the steady state is the only time you buy new capital, S times the function of capital, is in order to replace the capital that has fully depreciated. Fully depreciated means you can't use it anymore. Don't you wish that in the buildings at Queens College, where we have classrooms with windows that you can't open and close them, that's part of the capital stock, or boards and you walk in there and the boards are all messed up, or you go into rooms that still don't have a really good computer setup or screen system or anything like that. Don't you wish that they would get rid of that and replace it with more modern stuff? Of course you do. A lot of the stuff on the Queens College campus is antiquated. It was there when I was there. I mean, the chairs that you guys sit on, I sat on when I was a Queens College student. I'm not kidding you. Those are the same chairs. Sometimes I look to see if my graffiti is on any of them. I wrote the same kinds of graffiti that you wrote on it. So here's the point. Eventually you get to a point where you just have too many. And someone just said something about airlines. If you're running an airline, you could keep adding airplanes, but that may not be the right thing to do. You have another airplane, you roll it out, and the first plane was fully packed, and the second one, you're at 80% of capacity, and the third one, you're down to 70% of capacity. You keep adding airplanes, and you can have 20% of capacity if you use all those airplanes. Think about it. So then maybe what you do is stop buying airplanes, except to replace the ones that are fully depreciated, that you take out of service. That's the concept. And in this particular model, it says how much in the aggregate we're able to invest in this capital depends upon the savings rate, because I has to equal to S. The amount of investment, which is the act of increasing the capital stock, depends on our savings rate. That's what it's saying. Is that clearer? Yes? Is that clearer? Help me. Come on. Okay. So it's 11:45, and we will finish this up on Monday. Don't leave. Do not leave. We will finish this up on Monday. In the interim, study this slide and the next one, and come to class on Monday full of questions about things you don't understand. I promise you that if you study these, if you start writing out some of this stuff for yourself, you'll pick up the entire solo model in 15 minutes. I promise you it won't take more than 15. It's really, really very simple. It's just complicated. It's not hard. It's just a lot of things to remember, a lot of symbols and the like. So I would tell you, focus on slide number 34, slide number 35, come to class on Monday full of questions. Yes, the slides, like all things, are on Blackboard. Okay, what I'm going to do now is go to the homework questions, because I want to respect the work that so many of you did. And I want to be sure, because everyone's saying, you're looking for feedback on the homework questions, and I can't do that for 95 students. So let's do it here. Homework questions. And let's see how you do with these questions. So I'll shut up and someone volunteer an answer. So Paul Krugman, who now is one of the professors at the CUNY Graduate Center, that's where CUNY's PhD program is. He writes as a columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote an interesting statement. Quote, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. To what was Krugman referring? Why is productivity growth so pivotal to real economic growth and to the maintenance of price stability? I think we covered this in the first half hour of our class. So I would be thrilled if somebody would offer an answer to this question based upon our discussion of productivity and TFP and how productivity plays into sustained growth rates and all that. Anybody? Don't be shy. This is how you get your grade up, ladies and gentlemen. And this is how you learn. I don't know if any of you has ever been an athlete. Hold on one second. I don't know if any of you have ever been an athlete, but if you're an athlete, one of the cliches that you teach people, and I've been a baseball coach for more years than you have been alive, believe me, I always tell my players, the way you practice is the way you're going to play in a game. This is practice. Still nobody?
I think I could try to answer, Professor.
Fantastic. I'm proud of you. Who is this?
Ahmed? Yeah.
Oh. Thank you, Ahmed.
So obviously, the more effective you are at turning your capital into output will result in a greater yearly increase in your GDP, and even the slightly greater increase in GDP, like 2% compared to 1%, can result in drastic differences in terms of overall GDP and the quality of life in the long run. For like you mentioned that in order to double your GDP, it's like the equation is 70 over the percent increase. So if it's 2%, it'll take 35 years. And if the percent increase is 1%, it will take 70 years. So the more effective you are at turning capital into output, which is productivity, the greater that GDP yearly increase will be, and the better off you will be in the long run.
You know, Ahmed, I would give you a grade of A on that answer. The reason I'm not going to give you an A+ on that answer is that you're just missing one little thing.
Professor, what about the productivity parameter? So it has a big effect on the productivity, on the GDP. So it means if the productivity parameter is high, then and the capital that we are putting into the process is high, then our GDP or our productivity, overall productivity, is going to be high also.
Yep, absolutely. You're missing the same. You're missing one small point. It's the same small point.
And labor too?
Yeah, you left out labor.
Yeah, and labor has
because
a big
productivity depends not just on the amount of capital we have and how we use it, but it's the amount of capital we have per unit of labor that we're really looking for. But I would say that you've done very, very well with this, and thank you for your answer. We'll skip the solo growth model question now, and we'll come back to that on Monday. Why have emerging market economies grown so much faster than developed market economies over the past 3 decades? Think about it. Why have growth rates in places like China, India, Indonesia, South Korea, Israel, why have those economies grown faster than the developed market economies? I think I've addressed this. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
Yes, I remember you, I mean, if we just talk about the slides that you just, today's lessons, then the key point would be that every country started with a different base, because developed markets have a higher base and the lower ones have a lower base, so their growth margins would seemingly seem to be much higher than any other developed markets.
Yeah, and when they start off that lower base, the capital that they're putting in is going to be newer. You know, think about this. we still have massive, massive amounts of copper wire under the streets of New York City, because that copper wire used to carry our phone system when we had landlines. And we were still using landlines when these emerging market economies that didn't have landlines, I mean, their phone system was really non-existent or awful, they went immediately to satellite electronics, to satellite telephony. And so they had better and newer stuff because they were starting from a newer and smaller base. And so they grow faster. So one of the things I pointed out to you is that new equipment is always better than old equipment. But if you've already got equipment in place, think about it. You got to use it. So compare the subway system in New York City, which was developed over 100 years ago, say with the subway system, say, even in the US, say in Atlanta or San Francisco or Washington, D.C., which are only half the age of the subway system in New York. Well, it's much better. But our stuff is old. And of course, it breaks down more, and you have signal troubles and switching problems and flooding and all kinds of things because it's older. So the base being newer is one aspect, and then the new stuff is always better than the old stuff, and that's what you're getting in these emerging market economies, and that's why they creep up and grow faster over time than the developed market economies do that are bigger, but they're older. And again, I ask you to pay attention to the subway system here, which is miraculous. Look at how many people we move in a system that's over 100 years old. But it's old. It's not going to be as efficient as the subway system in, well, I was in Hong Kong. I mean, I was in Hong Kong. My wife is laughing because she knows this is true. I was in Hong Kong. I was in Taipei. I was in Singapore. And you look at their systems and it's so much better, but it's so much newer. So that's the answer there. There's two types of capital used by your doctor, the transit authority, Skype, Starbucks, or a football team. So just to make sure you understand the concept of capital, give me two kinds of capital that might be used by your doctor. Just two examples.
Medicine, needles.
Now get more sophisticated. Get bigger.
You could sum it up as equipment for one of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe an MRI, a CAT scan, something like that. Yeah. Anything in the office, just the gurney, they put you down and they say, lay down, I'm going to, poke you in your stomach and see, even a stethoscope is considered, or a thermometer or a blood pressure machine is a kind of capital. Okay. Just to be sure you get it. Why is capital growth so important to productivity increases and long-term growth of a country? I think you've addressed that. And to what extent is public infrastructure critical to the success of private businesses? So what do we mean by public infrastructure? Give me a couple of examples of public infrastructure.
Roads.
Mm-hmm.
Schools.
Transit stations.
Yeah. You got it. Okay. So you see what we're doing? We're rebuilding LaGuardia Airport. I mean, it's like building an entirely new airport. That's huge. How should public infrastructure be funded? Who should pay for it?
Government.
Government, yeah.
Entirely?
Public too.
No, the
Taxpayers.
businesses too, maybe.
Business contracts.
Yeah.
So I throw this out because this is an opinion question, okay? And I don't really like opinions unless you back it up with facts. So I'm going to give you a fact, okay? How would Amazon be able to do what it does if not for the public infrastructure? If not for the cell towers that are out there? If not for the satellites up in space that are taking communications from Earth, taking the orders that you put in for something on Amazon and then sending it down to Amazon and having them fill it? How could Amazon exist if part of the public infrastructure called the United States Postal Service didn't exist? If the roads weren't in good shape for them to take their boxes and ship them to your door, they'd be in a lot of trouble. One could easily argue that Amazon should be taxed or forced to pay for some of that infrastructure. You know, some people have argued that if you take somebody, let's take Jeff Bezos, who of course is the multi-billionaire from Amazon. Think about this for a minute. There have been proposals that said, let me just back up a second. People might say, yeah, he became a multi-billionaire, but he didn't do it on the sweat of anybody. He created jobs. He created incomes. He created opportunities all over the place. What about all the companies that sell to Amazon that made profits and were able to hire people? Amazon has been a big contributor to the growth of both the economy and then one level down to the labor force and to wages and making people have a middle-class life. One could argue that. He didn't do anything off the sweat of the brow of people. In other words, he didn't run a sweatshop. He didn't have, a farm somewhere where he paid, sub-minimum wages to people. That could be one argument. But there's another argument that says, all of that's true, but he couldn't do what he did if not for the public infrastructure. He should be taxed more. He should be paying heavy taxes because his business couldn't even exist if not for the public infrastructure. As I pointed out before, if you don't have good roads, you can't deliver Amazon packages. If you don't have the internet, you can't have Amazon. If you don't have Wi-Fi, you can't have Amazon. If you don't have cell towers, you don't have Amazon. If you don't have ports, because so much of what Amazon sells is imported, you don't have that, you can't have Amazon. These are the two counter arguments that you get with something like this, and it's why I asked the opinion question, and where you come out on that is a matter of your political point of view. So I'm going to stop here. It's 11:58. We will continue with the solo model. Please, please, please study those two slides, 34 and 35. Play with them. And I promise you, when you play with them, you will get them right. And I will correct those two symbols where I had plus signs instead of equal signs so that it doesn't confuse you. Okay? So thanks for your attention today. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Professor.
Oh, you're very welcome. You don't need to thank me. I get paid to do this. They do pay me $5 an hour to do this. So.
Yeah, but you're giving us your time, so that's much more worth than everything. So thank you.
You're very, very kind. Thank you so much. It really means so much to hear something like that from students.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Take good care, everybody. Be well. And I am going to go to 65th and 3rd with my wife right now to get something to eat.